Welcome to the fourth episode of the podcast, I Don't Know Anything. My name is Emma, and in this podcast, I will explore world issues that I don't know anything about. I hope by inviting young people from these countries, you can understand the news a little bit better. Today I'm joined by Ala Hassan, a Kurdish Iraqi graduate in international political economy and founder of the Queen Mary Kurdish Society. He's also co-founder of the Kurdish Intersociety Platform, which brings together Kurdish societies in the UK. Today he's going to explain to me who the Kurds are and why we need to talk about the Kurds right now. Welcome, Ala.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for having me.
So let's just dive right in. I don't know anything about the Kurds. Could you provide me some background information before I ask you all of these other questions?
Yeah, so in short, the Kurds are an ethnic group in the Middle East. They are the biggest stateless people. They are a nation without a state of their own. The Kurds are divided between four countries: Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. They're an ethnic group with their own language, with their own culture, with their own food, and their own particular history. They are in a lot of ways similar to the people they live alongside, such as the Arabs, the Iranians, and the Turks. But on the whole, they are different, just as Arabs and Iranians and Turks are different to each other. They're often not known about. Their struggle is in a lot of ways similar to the struggle of the Palestinian people. They're one of those nations that are persecuted and oppressed and are often not in the media spotlight, but they have been in the last few years, which has been the reason why Kurds are a little bit more known now.
Can you, why are Kurds prosecuted? Can you tell me that? Is it just because they're a minority group and they're not, for example, in Iraq, they're not Arabs, but they're a different minority group?
Yeah, that's basically what it is. The Kurds inhabit the borderlands of four different countries, like I said: Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And as it is with minorities, minorities are often prosecuted in countries where the majority are of a different ethnic group or of a different religion to the minority. And that's the case with Kurds. I mean, to really understand the situation of Kurds, it's always good to go back to the very beginning to understand why Kurds do not have a country and why they ended up being separated into four different countries. So I can just go into that if you like.
Yeah, please do.
So it all really happened after World War I. As we both know, the idea of independent nation states wasn't really the norm until the sort of 20th century. Those countries that we know today did not exist before the 20th century. What happened after World War I? We saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which was led by Turkey. So France, Britain, and America won the First World War against Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the British and the French divided up the Middle East, which was for a large part controlled by the Ottoman Empire, or was previously a part of the Ottoman Empire. So when they divided up the Middle East, and there were many treaties signed. When they divided it up, they decided to divide up the whole Ottoman Empire, and they even divided up Turkey. And this was the new makeup of Middle East the division that they wanted to create. You can see it in the Sykes-Picot Agreement and in the Treaty of Sevres. At least the Treaty of Sevres is more important for the issue of Kurds. So that's where the British and the French decided to create different spheres of influence and different territories they would control, and they wanted to break up Turkey, even the Turkey we know today. And within that treaty, Kurds were promised as a land. It didn't really encompass all of Kurdistan, but encompassed a significant part. And so Kurds were promised a country of their own, just like Iraq was given a country, Syria was given a country, Jordan was. Who else? Even Saudi Arabia and those countries were also made countries, and even Qatar and Kuwait and all of those Gulf countries were created with the approval of Britain and France. So they were promised a country, but then Turkey fought against the British and the French, and a new treaty was signed after Turkey won that war, and it was called the Treaty of Lausanne. And the Treaty of Lausanne destroyed that the previous agreement that Kurds would be given some sort of land and some sort of independence. And so what we had was the formation gradually after World War I was the formation of Turkey, the formation of Iraq, the formation of Iran was independent. That's a very different story, but Iran was already in existence. And then we also had the formation of Syria. So in the midst of all of this, in the midst of post-World War I and colonial divisions of the Middle East, Kurds were left stateless, and they were divided up into 4 countries. And so that pretty much explains everything that has happened ever since and everything that is happening right now.
So could you explain to me what is happening now then? So the Kurds are stateless now, and they're being prosecuted. And it's also been in the news a bit about what's happening. I think I saw something also with Turkey and the Kurds.
Yeah. So the last, so ever since, let's say the 1920s, there's been revolt after revolt after revolt by the Kurds against the ruling regimes that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most Kurds, occupy Kurdistan. We do see them as colonizers. So there's been continuous revolts, and this whole sort of tension and conflict between the Kurdish political parties and movements in each country against the regimes of each country has led to different outcomes. So in the last 20 years or so, we've seen major improvements for the Kurdish people. Today in Iraq, there is a Kurdistan regional government which oversees an autonomous Kurdish region. So they have their own parliament. It has its own army. It has its own border. It's a de facto state, and it runs like a de facto state. It's very much independent from Iraq, and it's in the north of Iraq, and that's where I am from. So the situation for Kurds in Iraq has improved massively, and you could more or less say they have a state of their own in Iraq. But of course, the Kurdish people span 4 different countries, and the biggest population of Kurds is actually in Turkey. So while the situation in Kurdistan has massively improved, what we saw in Syria was a really bad situation under the Bashar regime, and obviously under his father's regime for many, many decades. But in 2012, during the Syrian civil war, the Kurds in Syria created a self-administration like the Kurds in Iraq. They created an autonomous region and have since 2012 more or less have had a autonomous region of their own. It's not recognized by almost no one in the world, but it's there and it's functioning, and it controls around, if I'm correct, 20% of the Syrian country. And it controls a big part of the oil reserves of Syria too. It has a lot of power. And then in Turkey, we have a Kurdish insurgent group called the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, that have been fighting since 1984. And they have also achieved major breakthroughs, just like the Kurds in Iraq and Syria. They've been successful alongside their sort of alongside another group, which is a political party called HDP. HDP has gained popularity in Turkey over the last 10 years or so, and it became actually the third biggest political party in Turkey, which is a major achievement for a Kurdish political party. But their situation is really bad because they continue to face discrimination and prosecution and oppression by the Turkish state. In Iran and Turkey, the situation is pretty much, in a lot of ways, is similar because they both populations, both Kurdish populations, continue to face prosecution, oppression, and suppression. They lack, for the large part, they lack the right to vote for their own political parties. They're not allowed to freely protest. In a lot of ways, they're not also allowed to freely practice their culture. In Iran, it's a bit better, but it's just as bad. So that's more or less the current situation in the 4 different parts. And then I guess we can go into more detail a bit, afterwards about each particular country, because the dynamics are just so different.
Yeah. Just to kind of imagine like how it is to be a Kurd in, for example, Turkey or Iran, where you could be prosecuted. Would you be able to be openly Kurdish there, or is that possible, or is it just not like really practicing your own culture or speaking your language? Like what do I need to imagine if we think about prosecution?
Okay, so like we said, in Iraq is good.
Yeah.
Mary Kurdistan is good. We can do everything freely, because Kurds have become so powerful there. In Syria, ever since there's been the de facto self-administration, where a government has been established with its own army in northern Syria, Kurds are able to practice their culture, are able to vote freely. In fact, that's the only region where genuine elections are actually held. And I don't think elections have been held in Syria since, I don't know if elections have ever been held in Syria before that, like genuine, free and fair elections. So in Syria, it's also good, although the situation in Syria is also a bit more complicated because certain Kurdish parts are occupied by Turkey, where it's just as bad as the other parts. Now in Turkey, an interesting fact about Turkey, it was up to 1991, the Kurdish language was banned. So even speaking Kurdish was banned. You couldn't speak Kurdish. In Turkey, they've given some rights since the 1990s or early 2000s that for the most part they've taken away, that Erdogan, which is the president of Turkey, has taken away. So it's very hard to practice your culture. So whenever there is New Year celebrations or major cultural festivals, Kurdish cultural festivals, they're often shut down and protesters are often imprisoned, like people who celebrate it and stuff. When it comes to speaking Kurdish, a lot of Kurdish people, the systemic oppression has been so bad that a lot of Kurdish people in Turkey can't even speak Kurdish because the Turkish state system has, for the most part, there's only very few schools in Turkey that teach Kurdish. For the most part, kids are growing up in Turkish institutions, Turkish schools, they learn Turkish, and they don't really pick up the Kurdish language. So they don't speak and they don't pass it on to their kids, and it kind of reinforces that thingy. When it comes to economic rights, they probably have economic rights in Turkey, but when it comes to political rights, so being able to vote for the political party if you want, being able to vote for Kurdish political parties, being able to protest freely, that just for the large part doesn't exist. When it comes to social rights, also just the same, to practice your culture and stuff, very difficult, and Kurds are very oppressed in that regards. In Iran, it's slightly different. Economically, I'm sure, they're able to obviously have their own businesses and make money and stuff. Of course, though, it's important to mention that both in Iran and Turkey, the Kurdish areas are they're always, and they are the most impoverished and the most underdeveloped. And that's a very purposeful act by the regimes in power. It's not a coincidence that the Kurdish areas in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria are the most underdeveloped, except the Iraqi one, actually, because the last few decades they've been able to develop the economy and the region. So in Iran, Iran has had and this is a really interesting fact, Iran has historically been very accepting of minorities because the Persian empires were a mixture of many different people. So they've always accommodated different religions and different cultures. Although since 1979, it's not been like that as such. But Kurds in Iran have more cultural rights. So you see Kurds in Iran wearing their traditional clothes more often than Kurds in Turkey would. More people speak their own language, and they are in a lot of ways just very Kurdish, and they're allowed to be Kurdish. But when it comes to politics, no. No Kurdish political parties are allowed. There may be one or two I don't know about, but for the last part they're not allowed. And I think that holds true probably for all of Iran. You know, the Iranian regime is very undemocratic and authoritarian. So that's the situation really in all four parts.
So from what I'm hearing, what Turkey is doing, it's like a strategy probably to kind of eradicate the Kurdish people, or at least their culture, and to make sure that because the children don't learn the language, then eventually they will become, in that sense, Turkish, and not any, like that the whole Kurdish group or population will just be eradicated. Is that correct?
That's very correct. That's very correct. And in fact, what you're saying holds true for all four parts. So ever since the 1920s, ever since these nations formed themselves, those countries have been doing their utmost to erode the identity of the Kurdish people, because Kurds have always posed a problem for them. Here is a nation of people, for example, in Turkey, here's a nation of 20, 25 million people who aren't Turks and who do not want to be Turks. How do you deal with them? You know, here's a nation who wants rights, who wants to have some sort of autonomy because they want to determine their own destiny, their own economic, social, and political policies.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is not to say that Kurds were problems or problematic people, and that's why they've been oppressed. No, it's that these the ideas of nation states where there is one flag, one language, one people. Holds problematic when you have minorities that are so huge, who do not have your flag, your language, or your identity. How do you deal with them? So ever since the 1920s, Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq have tried their very best to stop Kurds from speaking their language, stop Kurds from practicing their culture, and most importantly, to stop Kurds from having any kind of political power.
Yeah.
That's been very threatening to them, and it continues to be very threatening. I mean, take Turkey, who banned the Kurdish language for many, many, many years, and who still does it, who still does that systemically. Take Syria, where one popular way they try to erode the Kurdish identity is, and this is something that's happened in Iraq and Syria, where they'll try to bring in Arab settlers into Kurdish areas and settle them there. And what you have over time is an area which was Kurdish but is no longer Kurdish, that actually become Arabized. They try to Arabize areas so that that land is no longer Kurdish or has any kind of sort of link to the Kurdish people. I mean, Saddam was very open about it and was probably the most brutal when it came to eroding the Kurdish identity. I don't know if you know about the Anfal massacre in the 1980s, where he used gas bombs and bombed the city of Halabja and gassed and killed around, they say, between 3,000 and 5,000 people.
Oh my God.
In a space of days. He used chemical weapons. I don't know if it's chemical weapon, but it was gas. It was the use of gas, which is obviously forbidden under international law. Saddam in total killed around 180,000 Kurds between the 70s to the early 2000s. So he was like, this was directly killing people and directly trying to sort of erode their identity. So those are just some examples of the kind of oppressions the Kurds have faced.
But you said that the Kurdish people were the biggest stateless people. How many people are we talking about?
Oh yeah, I should have. So yeah, figures vary mainly because the countries Kurds inhabit try their very best to make sure the numbers are down.
Yeah.
So the estimates that I've heard and that are usually sort of agreed on are somewhere between um, 30 million to 40, 30 to 45 million people. Those are the estimates.
Wait, 30?
Yeah, 30 to 45 million.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Just to put that in perspective, like my country, the Netherlands, is like 16 million people only.
Yeah.
So that's like, it could fit into a whole country. It's insane.
That's true. I mean, so like, Rohingya Muslims, they've been very, I mean, two nations that are often spoken about, that suffer a sort of a similar fate to Kurds, the Palestinians and the Rohingya. The Rohingya are at the very most between 1.3 million to 2 million people, and they're a stateless people too. And the Palestinians, I think they're around 2 or 3 million, if that. And then you have the Kurds who are around 30, 40 million, and they're in the Middle East, and it's so strange that their plight is not heard or spoken about as much as the other people's. So there is a double standard that unfortunately leads to an unfair coverage of what's actually happening and perpetuates the situation of the Kurdish people and perpetuates their statelessness.
Do you also think that the West played a role in all this? Because you're telling me now that the Kurds are not enough in the news, and probably that's also a responsibility of the West to think about the Kurds. And as you said as well, the French and the British split up the Ottoman Empire, so they also were partially responsible for what happened with the Kurds.
Definitely. I mean, like, if we go back to the division of the Middle East, many nations were divided up, many tribes, and many peoples who held a sort of a shared identity were divided up between countries. And this was definitely the fault of the West, and this was during a period of colonialism. The situation of Kurds is a direct result of that, yes. The actions of Western nations such as Britain and France. And that has left Kurds stateless. Now, obviously, colonialism transformed into what a lot of scholars termed neocolonialism, where the oppression of Western states turned from its previous military gruesome form to a more economic and political domination of countries. So the US, Britain, the US and Western powers still play a huge role in Africa, in South America, and Middle East, but they play a more economic and political role, and that's how they neo-colonize these countries. So for the case of Iran, since 1979, we can't really talk about the West as much, but this applies for Turkey and Iran. Turkey and Iraq. So the US actually armed Saddam Hussein in the 80s, and it was the same arms that they armed Saddam Hussein with that Saddam used against Kurds to kill them. In 1991, when the first Gulf War started, the Kurds were fighting Saddam Hussein, and they were pivotal in defeating Saddam in 2003. But what happened was America never really gave the protection they needed. So what we saw in early 2000s, obviously it was thanks to America and the West that we actually got autonomy in Iraqi Kurdistan, and it was thanks to the US invasion. Not to say I'm in favor of the US invasion, but I was in favor of some kind of intervention to help Saddam Hussein, because I don't think he would have ever gone away. So the US and Britain have been silent about the situation of Kurds in Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. If they had been a bit more vocal, they could have stopped, or they could have reduced the suffering of Kurds. I mean, America and Britain still arm Turkey. They still sell weapons to Turkey, which Turkey then uses to oppress Kurds and get involved in all these different countries. I mean, the Kurds have been betrayed by the West many times, even though Kurds have always done their best to be an ally of the West. In 2019, Trump and the US said we will withdraw our support from the Kurdish forces in northern Syria, and that's what prompted Turkey to invade and occupy significant parts of northern Syria, which were Kurdish lands. And no one did anything about that, and the West was silent about that. Their silence and their continued economic support and military support to these nations are critical, if not the most important reason why these nations can continue to get away with the terrible things they do to the Kurdish people. So definitely, yes, the West plays a very big role.
So from what I'm hearing as well is that the West uses the Kurds, for example, to help them in Syria, or to fight in Syria. But then on the other hand, they're also providing weapons, providing power to these countries that actually suppress them as well.
Yeah, basically. I mean, where America sees an opportunity to use Kurds, he uses them. And what's America and the West, and they usually act, at least the US and Britain, they usually act in line with each other.
Yeah.
They use them when it serves their purposes, and often when this purpose has been served, they leave the Kurds to hang high and dry and withdraw their support from them. And that's where Kurds feel the wrath of Turkey, Iran, or Syria, or Iraq, who they've basically done something to for the United States. And that's the sad part. They do get used. And the thing is, it's not getting used as such. It's in the sphere of international relations. You take certain actions with other groups or entities because your interests align. And that's what Kurds do. When their interests align with the West, they act together with the West. But unfortunately, it's always a one-sided kind of outcome where the West benefits from the Kurds and the Kurds don't get anything in return. In fact, they often get left in a worse position than they were in before. I mean, to give an example, in 2014, when ISIS attacked Iraqi Kurdistan, when ISIS basically invaded large parts of Iraq, Mosul, and many different parts, Kurds went and controlled Kirkuk and many other areas that the Iraqi army fled from, and they helped secure all these areas. And obviously this was good, but this served the West's needs, mainly because the more ISIS controlled areas, the more of a threat it became. And ISIS was waging many suicide attacks in mainland Europe. What happened then, once the fight against ISIS was finished and Kurds were supported by the West to defeat them in Iraq at least, in 2017, the Iraqi army came back and wanted all those lands back that Kurds had secured from invasion by the ISIS forces. And the US just didn't do anything. They just stood back and said, sorry, Iraq's coming back, take those lands, we're not going to help you. And so what happened was all those areas that a lot of them were Kurdish areas that Iraq won't let the Kurdish autonomous region control. They were lost again back to the Iraqi army. And there, what you had is, and the Kurdish people in Iraq gave thousands of lives to fight ISIS and to secure those areas. And what happened was, a few years later, Iraqi army comes back, takes it all again, and the West doesn't do anything about it. And so there are many examples of betrayals that we can talk about, but that's just one example.
And you just briefly also talked about the northern part of Syria, where they're starting a democratic government, or they start elections. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so in the Syrian civil war, or at least the uprising, started around 2011. Now, the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is active in Turkey and in Iraq, they had their own political party in Syria called the PYD. At the start of the war in northern Syria, you had lots of extremist groups. What happened, as soon as the civil war started around 2012 or 2013, I don't remember correctly, the Syrian regime basically, if this is Syria and this is the Kurds up north, the Syrian army basically just withdrew from all the Kurdish areas to go control the main areas like Damascus and other areas that are more important to them. They didn't really care about the Kurdish areas, but all they could get invaded by anyone. This was never a priority for them. So what happened, the PKK sent its own forces to northern Syria and helped create an army called the YPG and the YPJ. The YPG is the People's Protection Units, and the YPJ is the Women's Protection Units. These two forces gradually, over the next few years, controlled all the Kurdish areas up north of northern Syria. They controlled it because the Assad regime withdrew and there was no one to protect the Kurds. And it was a chance for the Kurds to actually, once again, regain control over their own areas. So in the process, they fought the various extremist groups, including ISIS, and they managed to protect the northern part of Syria. While doing that, they also created their own structure of governance. Their ideology comes from the PKK once again. They're an offshoot of the PKK. They called it Rojava, which means Western Kurdistan. That's how we refer it to, because if Kurdistan were to be a country, Syrian Kurdistan would be on the western part, would be the western part of Kurdistan. So we call it Rojava, which means west. Actually means where the sun sets. Yeah, because that's the west, right? That's where the sun rests. Sets. So the ideology of the PKK is one. They changed their ideology in the late 1990s, and they believe in a bottom-up democratic structure where you have both elections, like free and fair elections, to elect representatives who would go to parliament and represent you. So on one hand, and then they also have grassroots structures where it's more of a delegate system where they have local communes all around northern Syria, and they make decisions at the very bottom, and then these decisions and then are elevated up and up and up in the sort of in a sort of in the uppermost body. These decisions are then sort of relayed, and so what happens is you have like a representative form of democracy as well as a direct form of democracy. So that's what they've been creating, and it's a very fascinating experiment in direct democracy, a sort of a hybrid system of direct and representative forms of democracy. The other most fascinating part of the revolution in Rojava has been the women's movement. So the ideology of the PKK says that first and foremost, to liberate society, especially Middle Eastern societies, you need to liberate women, because women the oppression, the patriarchal system of Middle Eastern societies rests first and foremost on the oppression of women. And once you liberate women, you can start to liberate society in a genuine way. Those go back to the lessons of decolonization. So you had many countries become independent post World War II and World War One. But what happened? You ended up with a very undemocratic and patriarchal regime and societies where men dominated and women, who form half of society, never got any rights that they were promised.
Mm.
How did the revolution in Rojava improve the situation of women? And why is it one of the most radical experimentations in women's rights? So, firstly, well, you saw changes in different spheres. For one, they created a separate army for the Kurdish women.
Mm.
And this army, called the YPJ, has fought alongside the YPG to defeat ISIS and to protect the Kurdish areas as well as many Arab areas. This army is led by, obviously, it's led by women, and they fight alongside men. In fact, an interesting fact, Raqqa, was the capital city of the Islamic State.
Mm.
The push to liberate Raqqa consisted of 16,000 Kurdish and Arab soldiers. It was led by the Kurdish administration of northern Syria, Rojava. And the leader of the 16,000 fighting force was a woman.
Oh, wow.
And it was fascinating to see in the Middle East a woman leading an army of 16,000 to liberate one of the most patriarchal and backward and oppressive terrorist regimes that have ever existed. And she did so successfully. And a big part of that fighting force was also women, were also women fighters. And this became a very big deal in the media, seeing women fight in the Middle East alongside men, often more ferociously than the men they fought with, and give their lives to liberate areas that were controlled by the Islamic State, and to once again bring, peace and security and freedom to these areas. So that was one, by creating a separate army for the Kurdish women. The second was, and this is really fascinating, from the very bottom to the very top of the political structure of northern Syria, the self-administration of northern Syria, from the commune all the way to the very highest level, which is the Syrian National Council, if every chair or every leader of every committee or every group or of the parliament, of the council of anything, of the regional government, there would be a female and a male head at every level, from the very bottom to the top, and as well as a 40% quota of women at every level too. So what you had there was a very genuine push to have women represented both at every level and at every leadership level in the country. And I think that's fascinating. I don't think I've ever seen that anywhere before, at least the co-chair system of having a male and female head. In fact, the ruling council of northern Syria is led by a female and a male, a Kurdish female and an Arab male, and they're not. It's not tokenistic. Her name is Ilham Ahmed. She's a very, very charismatic and powerful leader in northern Syria, and she's been all around Europe and has been pivotal in getting recognition for northern Syria. That's another way. So the political aspect is the second way. The third way has been creation of cooperative businesses, where it's led entirely by women. So they've tried to push and fund businesses that are cooperative, so where there is no kind of, there aren't one or two people that take the profits are shared between all individuals. So you had women-led cooperative businesses, bakeries, textile factories, lots of different ones that I can't remember now. I actually did my dissertation on this. Yeah, so there are really there's a lot of really promising examples. So they've tried to really and in the social sphere, they've tried their best to instill this new sort of mindset of women being equal to men, and women being leaders, and women being involved in military, political, and economic matters in the minds of society. I mean, you know how relatively conservative Middle Eastern countries can be, especially in the northern region of Syria, where it's mostly villages, and villages are often much more conservative than urban areas. So, I mean, it's been very fascinating what they've done for women's rights and for democracy in northern Syria, but unfortunately, it has been under attack by both the Syrian government and by the Turkish government. And just to mention, and this is probably very important, the YPG and the YPJ, the fighting forces of the Rojava self-administration, were the main players that defeated ISIS in Syria, and who took over the capital and liberated Raqqa, liberated Deir ez-Zor and all those areas. And in the process, they actually lost 11,000 lives. So 11,000 soldiers died in the process, and God knows how many civilians. And this was the war lasted from at least 2013 to 2019. Yeah, so it's a very long war. Many lives were lost. And the Kurds in northern Syria, I mean, the West, and pretty much the whole world is indebted to what the Kurdish forces did, alongside obviously the Arabs. We mustn't forget the Arabs and the Assyrians and other minorities in northern Syria. What they done to defeat ISIS, they gave a lot of lives, and if it hadn't been for their fight, ISIS would have still waged attacks in Europe and in many other countries, and would have still been a very big threat to all of us across the world.
It's how he talked about the democratic feminist structure of Rojava. It sounds really, really interesting, and I think even way more progressive than a lot of Western states are even. It's really cool to see how that's happening inside of a very Middle Eastern region, where, as you said, where it's very conservative. Just to continue, I know you were born in Iraq. Could you tell me a little bit about that? Because now you live in Britain, right? When did you move to Britain, and how was it in Iraq?
Yeah, so I moved. Well, I was born in Iraq. I was born in Kirkuk, and I was there till the age of 9. My family left Iraq in late 2005, shortly after the capture of Saddam Hussein and the Iraq invasion. We left obviously for security reasons. Iraq was a complete mess at that time. It was so dangerous. We left to have a better life. To flee from the war, flee from the insecurity, the poverty, and just the lack of life in Iraq. So life in Iraq. Well, it was hard enough being a citizen in Iraq, let alone being a Kurd too. So in Kirkuk, I was born in 1996, and the Kurds had been fighting a civil war against Iraq since forever. So there was a civil war within Iraq, especially in the 1990s. It was very intense. And at the same time, there was also the Iran-Iraq war that happened earlier. So Iraq was in a constant state of war. Growing up, it was unsafe, and it was very difficult because Iraq was under a lot of sanctions. I mean, things like fruits were scarce. I mean, we'd be lucky to like have a banana, like one banana once a week, because it was so expensive and it was just so rare. It's so scarce. Schools weren't that great. They were teaching Arabic in schools. We weren't taught in Kurdish. I wasn't taught in Kurdish. I was taught in Arabic in school. The the atmosphere was like, okay, so I'll tell you about we used to sleep at night, yeah, on the roof. I don't know, in Middle East they have that. You have a roof, sleep on the roof. You can see the sky and everything. I swear we there were nights when we would sleep. Gunfire was a normal thing. You hear gunfire all the time, shooting and stuff. That was normal. But we've seen rockets. At night when you're sleeping, you see rockets flying from one end to another. Yeah, and those were normal occurrences. Gunfire, shooting. And I was there during the Iraq invasion, so that was very, very intense, very, very unsafe. Uh, you know, and we had a bunker under our house. There were like 3, 4 rooms. I remember various times during my childhood there would be rumors that Saddam, because he had gassed Halabja in the 80s, there were rumors that he was going to gas Kirkuk, because Kirkuk it's mainly Kurdish. It's a mainly Kurdish city. I know many times we'd go into the bunker and hide for long periods of time because we were scared Saddam might gas the city. And obviously my family was scared and they wanted to protect us. I remember we'd put wet towels over our faces because apparently wet towels would stop the gas from going through. And I don't know if that actually worked, but I remember those scenes vividly. Yeah, I remember, gunfights, shooting, guns, and those were very normal things. I mean, on the city I lived, we used to go to Iraqi Kurdistan sometimes because, Kirkuk was slightly out of Iraqi Kurdistan, even though Kirkuk is a Kurdish city. One time we were away and we got news that one of the rockets, and this was after the Iraq invasion, a rocket, I don't know and that's the thing, you never knew where rockets came from. You never knew who was shooting, who was killing who. A rocket must have come and hit one of our neighbors who was one of our childhood friends and killed, I mean, the family were 8. It killed 5 of his family. And we received that news and it was really, really sad. I mean, it could have easily been our house that rocket landed on. We had many instances where close friends were killed. It was a really, really terrible time. So it was really good to flee Iraq and come to Britain, where my dad was at the time. My dad had left Iraq earlier. So we came here and thankfully, I mean, thank God we did come here, because honestly, we would have never known what would have happened to us. I mean, even if we had survived, the situation in Iraq is still really bad. I mean, politically, and in terms of security, it's really bad. You don't really have much to hope for in Iraq in terms of your career, in terms of your livelihood, and in terms of your health. So yeah, that was pretty much my experience in Iraq.
Thank you for opening up about this. I'm sure this must have been a very anxious childhood, especially if you said going to a bunker and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Just also about nowadays, what's your experience of being a young Kurdish person today, and what do you think the experience of young Kurdish people is today?
Yeah. Well, it differs once again because Kurds inhabit 4 different countries and they have formed slightly different identities and experiences based on the country they're in. I mean, for me, and I know for a lot of Iraqi Kurdish um, people, especially young people, my experience is slightly different because I wasn't born here. I was born back in Iraq, so I know my experience is slightly different to young Kurdish people who are born here.
Yeah.
I think, first and foremost, we experience what other people experience, which is your identity is slightly mixed up. You're Kurdish, but you're also here. You're Kurdish and you're British. For a lot of Kurdish young people that are born here, they experience that. They experience that kind of conflict between who they really are, and they often kind of lose that sense of connection to Kurdistan. Now, I know for most of us, we care deeply about what's happening back home, and the general feeling is one of hopelessness and one of what can we do? We can't really do much. So there's that frustration. I'm Kurdish, Kurdistan, the situation is really bad, and I can't really do much about it. I know that will probably apply for all parts. The situation of Turkish Kurds is slightly different. They don't even speak Kurdish. A lot, I don't want to generalize, but a lot of them do not speak Kurdish. So, well, at least I have some sort of, a lot of, young people, if they speak Kurdish, that forms a bigger part of their identity. But when you don't even speak the language, that's like a huge chunk of your identity also gone. And so you have even less of an attachment to it. I think I think the identities of young Kurdish people in Europe, I think over time just it erodes away. And if it, and that isn't for all people, but I think generally it kind of, it's hard to continue to hang on to your culture and language and history.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time too, there are a huge numbers of young Kurdish people that are still very attached to Kurdistan, and they are very active in this country, and they are very enthusiastic about their culture. And you see that in a lot of the Kurdish events you go to. I personally am very proud of the young Kurdish people in this country. They do a lot. And I don't blame them if they feel frustrated or just tired about doing things for Kurdistan and talking about Kurdistan. I get it. Overall, I think it's just as difficult for them as it is for African or Asian or South American or any other kind of people who have ran away from their countries because of conflict.
Yeah.
It's as difficult for them as it is for the others to, be who they are, to accommodate being a Kurd and a British person or a European person. Yeah.
It sounds, at least from everything that you told me, it sounds very, very hopelessness. That's what you said as well. Do you think there will eventually be an independent Kurdistan? Is there any hope for the future?
Yeah. So yeah, I might sound pessimistic and stuff, but I'm actually very hopeful, and I have very high hopes for the Kurdish people. I think, and I always say this, no one would have imagined in the 1990s that Kurds or 80s or 60s or 70s that Kurds would one day have an autonomous de facto state in Iraqi Kurdistan and also have a self-administration, a self-governing government in northern Syria, and a Kurdish political party in Turkey that would win 13% of the vote and become the third biggest political party and achieve many rights for Kurds. I think the Kurdish situation has vastly improved in the last 2 decades. It's volatile, definitely. Things can change like that. But my God, what Kurds have achieved since the early 2000s till now has been major. And I think if we can achieve autonomy in 2 different parts in the last, 2 decades or less than 2 decades, I'm sure in the next 2 decades, Kurds can achieve much, much more. So I'm very hopeful. The situation has vastly improved. Definitely, Kurds have achieved a lot. In terms of an independent Kurdistan, so the way, or in my opinion, and I think in an opinion of many others, I don't think we'll ever see a straight up independent Kurdistan, all 4 parts together. What we might see eventually is each particular part becoming independent at different points. I think the one that's ready most is Iraqi Kurdistan. They actually had a referendum in 2016, 2017, sorry, I can't remember correctly, where they voted for independence. And 93% of Iraqi Kurds said, yes, we want to become an independent Kurdistan. And that created a lot of trouble. So they're very ready, and I think Iraqi Kurdistan can become an independent nation at some point. I think over time, we will see more and more power, or Kurds getting more and more power in northern Syria and Turkey, and them also becoming autonomous, like the Iraqi Kurdish government is right now, and eventually become independent at some point in time. I mean, really, for me, and I think for Kurds too, the most important thing is not necessarily independence. The most important thing in the meantime is Kurds being able to live in peace and coexist alongside the other peoples they inhabit, the countries they inhabit with, in a way where their culture, their language, their history is respected, and where they can have the political rights they deserve as a people, where they can have their own political parties and where they can create their own organizations. I think, the situation in Turkey actually did get really good until 2015, where it just completely messed up. In northern, so there is a lot of hope. Things are improving. Things are going great. I think all Kurds need is more support from the West, to hold these countries accountable and stop funding them militarily. So I'm definitely very hopeful. And the thing is, you cannot stop a people from getting freedom. You just can't stop it. It will happen. It's a matter of time. All the major, Western empires fell, collapsed, and there was all these different people that had been colonized for so long, finally got their freedom. So I'm definitely hopeful, and I think it's just a matter of time. It may be 10 years, it may be 20 years, maybe 100 years. Doesn't matter. In my opinion, it will happen.
Is there anything that we can do to help? Because you said it as well, that for young Kurdish people, if it feels very frustrating and you feel like you can't do a lot, but is there anything that we will be able to do to help?
Well, there are 2 things I'll point out, and the first one is one I didn't mention before. One, I would like people to, and this is the case with a lot of Middle Eastern countries and Middle Eastern nations, to stop seeing the West and I might have even sounded like that too, so this might sound contradictory, to stop seeing the West and Israel as the main reasons for our conflict in the Middle East. It's not. Yes, the Western powers divided up the Middle East, but who continued to oppress and kill and murder and displace and prosecute Kurds and even their own peoples? It was the regimes that were in power. And these leaders of these countries, in my opinion, are largely responsible for what the Middle East, for what's happening in the Middle East. And on whose power do they continue to rest? I mean, one of the reasons why they continue to exist is because of the support they receive from their own people. You know, the Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, these are not good countries. Like the regimes are really bad regimes. They are responsible for the bad situation Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria are in. They're responsible for the lack of democracy. They're responsible for the impoverishment, for the poverty, for the lack of economic development, for the lack of women's rights. It's not Israel and the West that's stopping you from giving women rights, from allowing women to participate just as men do in the economic, political, and social sphere. It's not the West that's stopping you from building a better education system, building better healthcare systems. And this is the notion that people have, and I would love to see that kind of perception change, that kind of idea to change, the idea that it's all West's fault. No, in fact, in my opinion, I think, ever since these countries are formed, the biggest reason why they're in the situation they're in is the fault of the leaders, okay, and the fault of the people who have been, I think, the conservative tendencies, the sort of lack of progressiveness of these societies have been the reason. You do not understand how racist. Okay, so this is an example. So I don't think there's a single Arab person that would oppose Palestinian independence. They will wholeheartedly be in favor of it. But go ask Arabs that are from Iran or Iraq, do you support Kurdish independence? They'll say no, never. They don't deserve it. And you rarely see any Arab country come to the aid of Kurds or ever like stand up for the Kurdish people and say, I support the Palestinians, they're like 2-3 million people and their struggle is genuine. And in the same vein, I support the Kurdish people who are 30-40 million and their struggle is genuine too. No, you don't see that. The Syrian civil war, it wasn't the West or Russia as such that were the main problems. I mean, the Syrian civil war was a very regional war. You had Saudi Arabia, you had Turkey, you had Qatar, you had Iran, you had, who else? You had Hezbollah in Lebanon. Everyone was getting involved. Everyone for their own interests. I know people who are supporting Turkey or Iran because they stand up to the West. That's so wrong. These countries are so oppressive and so destructive for both their populations and for everyone else. So I would definitely push people to say, while international imperial powers are bad, these regional imperial powers like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran are just as bad for the people of the Middle East. and for their own nations. They're terrible. So that's one. The second would be like, yeah, I wouldn't I don't have anything else about, and I thought about this, and I was like, the main thing I would like people to do is just to learn a little bit, to learn more about the Kurdish people, to get more informed.
Yeah.
I think that's first and foremost all I would like to see. So I would definitely push people to get informed, learn a little bit more about the Kurdish people, and when you do get informed about it, if you think they deserve your support and your if you think they deserve your support, then please go ahead and support them, whether it's in terms of, simple things, whether it's in terms of sharing, popular contemporary issues that come up, whether it's signing a petition, or whether it's attending events. But I think for me, the most important thing is for people to know about Kurds and to have a stance on the Kurdish issue.
So also in line with this, what would you recommend for our listeners if they want to learn more about the Kurds? Any websites or Instagram pages or anything that you think would be helpful?
Yeah, so there are some Instagram pages I think that would be great. The Kurdish page, there's an Instagram page called the Kurdish page, really good. I'd recommend that. And then I'll just recommend some other pages that are available on different various social media websites. So, and these pages, what they're good at is they do a lot of events, and events are a great way to learn more about the Kurds. So one would be the Center for Kurdish Progress. You'll find them on Instagram and other places. They do very high-profile speaking events in Parliament, and recently they've been doing it online because you can't really do events anymore in person. The second one, I would say Kurd Akad UK. They do lots of events too. I'm also involved with them. They're very good. They do lots of events. And the third one is the Kurdish Intersociety Platform, which I've been involved in the last 3 years, and that I've been helping spearhead. That represents or brings together 18 Kurdish societies, and the Kurdish societies in the UK are very, very active. So if you tune in to them, you learn a lot, mainly because they do lots of events. So I'll strongly recommend those, and I can send it to you after.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much also for joining us today. This was really, really interesting. I definitely feel like I got a more understanding of who the Kurds are. And I also really loved how you talked about Rojava and how there's a new democratic structure that's being created there. I think this is also a very nice continuation of the last episodes where we talked about women's involvement in creating peace. And I think this really is a beautiful way to see how things actually can be. I hope you as a listener have also found it as interesting as I did. If you want to look up Ala online, you can find them at Ala_Firas, or you can find them via our Instagram page at I Don't Know Anything Podcast. I will also post all the links there that Ala talked about. Thank you for listening, and I hope you tune in next week. Have a great day.